In this video, we'll explore the concept of subtracting a positive, whether you're starting with a positive or a negative. So before we dive into subtraction, let's recap how to add positive and negative rational numbers. No matter the format of your rational number, so whether we're talking decimals, fractions, or integers, they all follow the same rules for adding them together. So if they're different signs, those are trying to cancel each other out or take away. So you would subtract those base numbers and keep the sign of what you have more of. If they're the same signs, they're trying to combine together. So you would add those base numbers and keep the original sign. So looking at number 1 with a negative 6 plus 15, those are different signs. So I would subtract the 15 and 6 to get 9 and see that I have more positives. So my answer would be a positive 9. Whereas in number 2, they are the same sign because they're both negative. So I'm really going to be combining those together or adding those and keeping my answer as the original negative that it started with. Number 3 is similar to number 1 because I have one positive number and one negative number. So I would subtract 28 minus 14 to get 14, but make it negative since that's what I have more of. So if you look at 4 and 5, definitely some messier numbers there. I have decimals and I have fractions, but it's going to follow that same process. So looking at number 4, I have one negative that I'm adding a positive to. So I'm really thinking of subtracting those base numbers. When that happens, I need to put a 0 here. I'll need to borrow a little bit and get an answer of 25 hundredths. Now I have more positives, so my answer would be a positive. So you can see it feels very similar to questions like 1 and 3. And number 5, I see two negatives, so those are the same signs. The extra process with fractions is to get common denominators. So I'm just going to change the 6th to 12ths, so I'm going to multiply everything by 2, and I get a negative 10 twelfths plus a negative 3 twelfths. From there, I'm really focused on these numerators. I see that they're both negatives, so I'm going to add those together to get a negative 13 twelfths. Or if you prefer a mixed number, that would be the same as negative 1 and 1 twelfth. So there's definitely some parallels between adding positive and negatives and subtracting. And we're going to begin by looking at subtracting a positive number. So it's important to note what those problems would look like when you're subtracting a positive, because here in a little bit, we'll start subtracting negatives. And that looks like back-to-back minus signs or negative signs. So very different from what that would do. So I always like to start just by visualizing what's really happening when you're subtracting a positive number. So let's say first you're starting with a positive, and I'll give you some examples to think about. Let's say we're starting here at a positive 3. If I'm subtracting positives, we're getting lower. So let's say for starters, I just subtract a 1. I would end up in the positives here because I didn't take away more than what I started with. But let's say you're starting at 3 and you're subtracting away 10. Now, all of a sudden, that's going to push you into the negatives for your answer because you're taking away more than what you started with. That would be a very similar example to debt. If you spend more money than you have, that's going to force you into that negative balance. Now, let's say, by comparison, we're starting with negatives already. So maybe we're starting at negative 3. If I'm dropping by 1, I'm dropping further into those negatives. Same would happen if I'm dropping by a lot more, like a 10. I'm getting further and further into the negatives. So when you subtract a positive, the sign of your answer really depends on where you started and how much you're subtracting from that. So let's talk more about the concept behind subtracting a positive number. We've already looked at the two different cases that you could have. You could be starting with a positive and subtracting from that, or starting with a negative and subtracting further. So what you're doing when you are subtracting positives, another way to say subtracting is you're taking away positives. So if we think about what happens when you take away positives, you're going to be getting less positive. Well, another way to say that you're getting less positive would be that you're actually getting more negative. So by taking away positives, you're getting less positive, and the same thing of less positive would be more negative. So we're going to go through these examples to talk more through how to expect if your final answer would be positive or if it would be negative. So this first example, I'm starting at positive 4 and subtracting 12. I'm taking away more than what I started with, so that would push me into the negatives. If I'm already in the negatives and I'm going further negative, definitely going to stay in those negatives. Again, negative 5 minus 1, we would want to think I'm getting even more negative from negative 5. If I'm starting with 15 and only taking away 3, that would keep me in the positives because I'm not taking away more than I had. And finally, a negative 2 minus 14. Again, I'm starting in the negatives already and getting even more negative from there. So let's start to explore what these answers would be, and we'll start with something that we're hopefully familiar with. I'm starting here at positive 7 and only taking away 4. So if I drop 4 from 7, I see that that would keep me in the positives at 3. By comparison, if I'm starting at positive 5 and taking away 9, I would expect to end up in the negatives since I'm taking away more than what I had. Exactly where we end up would come from dropping 9 from 5. So let's see, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 would push me all the way to negative 4. So I see I knew it was going to be negative, and the exact spot that it landed was a negative 4. If I'm starting in the negatives, I can see where I would end up with this first example of negative 1 minus 4. Already in the negatives, dropping even further, that would leave me here at a negative 5. And if I was starting further and only dropping a little, I'm still dropping further into the negatives, and this example would leave me with a negative 8. So let's use these examples to see really what's happening behind the scenes. We're coming off of learning how to add positive and negatives, and you should be feeling some similarities with these subtraction examples. If we look at 5 minus 9, we got an answer of negative 4. When we were focusing on addition, we would have gotten a negative 4 from something like 5 plus negative 9. Hopefully you agree that would be the same answer as negative 4 as well. Negative 1 minus 4, again, if we were thinking about an addition problem that would have that same answer, we could think of a negative 1 plus negative 4, right? Those are the same signs, so I would add those base numbers and keep it as a negative. That feels very similar to negative 6 minus 2. That would be the same as negative 6 plus negative 2. That would also have an answer of negative 8. So if we look at these subtraction and addition problems, you should notice that that first number is staying the exact same. I did not need to change that at all. Then it's kind of like taking that symbol and keeping it as that second number and really just kind of visualizing that plus sign in between those two numbers. So 5 minus 9 is the same as 5 plus negative 9. Negative 1 minus 4 is the same as negative 1 plus negative 4. So what that means is if you're taking away positives and getting more negative is the same as adding more negatives. So getting more negative is mathematically the same as adding a negative. Subtracting a positive, same as adding a negative. So that's a neat process to kind of help you get the hang of subtracting these positive numbers. If you need to, visualize it as adding a negative. So negative 3 minus 15, I'm already in the negatives, dropping even further. That would be the same as a negative 3 plus a negative 15. And maybe you feel more confident in this format than the original. So negative 3 dropping 15 more would put me down to a negative 18. 6 minus 28, again, if you need to, visualize that plus sign and think of it as 6 plus negative 28. That'll help me see I'm really subtracting those base numbers and that I have more negatives to start with. You may not need that strategy and can start to visualize these already. So if I have a positive 15, I'm subtracting 30. I can see that that's pushing me into the negatives. So I'm taking 15 positives away, and that would push me into negative 15. With a negative 62 minus 16, I'm already in the negatives, getting even more negative. So more negative from negative 62 would be a negative 78. So as far as these intro types of problems that you'll see, first really working on figuring out what the sign of your answer would be. So for something like 7 minus 14, I see I'm taking away more than what I started with, so I would expect a negative answer. Which of the following is equivalent to negative 6 minus 8? Equivalent means the same. So negative 6 minus 8, I know I could add that little plus sign in between, and that would be the same as negative 6 plus negative 8. These two things would have the same answer. Negative 5 minus 11, again, I like to visualize I'm at negative 5, I'm dropping even further into those negatives. So that would give me a negative 16. If you need a kind of in-between step, you could think of this as negative 5 plus negative 11 to help you figure out to add those together and keep your negatives.